Imagine, it's the early autumn of 1903. You're standing in the blue-black dark of an Oregon logging camp, somewhere deep in the Coast Range, where the firs grow so tall they disappear into the fog before you can find the tops. Your boots are already wet. They were wet yesterday. They'll be wet tomorrow. You reach out and grab the signal line, a thin rope strung through the timber, connected to a bell on the steam donkey 100 yards uphill. It's a routine gesture. You've done it 500 times. The Oregon Bureau of Labor's 1904 report would later note that a large proportion of serious accidents in the logging industry involved rigging failures during cable operations. But you don't know that yet. You just know the line feels right. Taut. Ready. The machine exhales a low, rhythmic hiss in the dark. It sounds like breathing. It isn't done with you yet. The camps of Oregon's Coast Range in the 1890s and early 1900s were not places you chose. Not really. You ended up there the way water ends up at the bottom of a hill, because everything above pushed you down. Men came from the Midwest, from Scandinavia, from worked-out mining towns in Nevada and Idaho. Some had families they were trying to feed from 1,000 miles away. Some had nothing and were trying to build something from scratch. Either way, you arrived at the end of a supply road that was barely a road, handed your name to a timekeeper who wrote it in pencil, and that was it. You were a logger now. The bunkhouses were long, low structures built from rough-cut lumber, and you slept shoulder to shoulder on wooden bunks stacked too high. Wool blankets, never quite dry. The smell was something. Wet wool, wood smoke, pine resin, the particular funk of men who worked 14 hours with no bath. Your boots went under the bunk at night. They were still damp in the morning. They were always still damp. The company controlled nearly everything. You bought your food at the company store. You paid for your bunk through wage deductions. You were paid not in dollars, but in scrip. Paper certificates redeemable only at that same company store at prices the company set. The Oregon Bureau of Labor documented the system extensively in the early 1900s, noting that workers in remote camps frequently ended the month with almost nothing after deductions cleared. You couldn't save your way out. You couldn't buy your way out. The nearest town with an independent bank might be 30 miles of mud road away. So you worked, and you worked some more. The tools were heavy and honest things. The crosscut saw, what the men called a misery whip, was 6 feet of Swedish steel with handles at each end, heavy enough that carrying it uphill through slash was its own labor before you touched a tree. The peavy hook, a long wooden handle with a steel spike and pivoting hook, moved and muscled logs into position. You learned these tools by watching men who'd survived long enough to have opinions worth hearing. The machine hadn't arrived yet in this part of the story, but it was coming, and when it did, it would change everything, including what it meant to die at work. By 1900, the Pacific Northwest was producing more than a third of the nation's lumber. Railroads needed ties by the million. The cities needed boards and beams at a scale the stripped eastern forests could no longer supply. The old-growth Douglas fir of Oregon and Washington was the answer, and the industry moved into those forests with a ferocity that still staggers the imagination. Stand at the base of a Coast Range Douglas fir in 1900 and look up. The tree is 200 feet tall. The trunk at the base might be 8 feet across, wider than most men are tall. These trees had been growing for 500 years, some of them for 800. And your job, your entire reason for being in that camp, eating that food, sleeping in that bunkhouse, was to bring them down. The men who did that work were called timber fallers. 2 men to a tree, working a crosscut saw from opposite sides, reading the lean of the trunk, and cutting the undercut first to direct the fall, then driving the back cut until 200 feet of ancient timber began its final arc toward the earth. It wasn't brute work, it was skilled work, requiring judgment about grain, lean, hidden rot. and the relationship of one falling tree to every other tree around it. A badly placed cut could send 200 feet of timber in the wrong direction. The men who survived long enough to become good at it were worth more than the company ever paid them. A company ledger from a major Oregon operator, cited in the Oregon Historical Quarterly, recorded board footage by the hundreds of millions, but the column beside it, listing men employed, told a quieter story. The ratio of board feet to bodies never improved much, season to season. Production went up. The danger went with it. Drop a comment telling me where you're listening from. It's remarkable to see how far these forgotten stories reach. The steam donkey changed logging the way the rifle changed war. Suddenly, you could do things that were previously impossible. And the cost of doing those impossible things fell, as it always does, on the men closest to the machine. John Dolbear patented his steam-powered log hauler in 1882, and by the 1890s, variations of the donkey engine were working their way through camps across the Pacific Northwest. The machine was a cast-iron boiler mounted on log skids, fueled by wood, driving a rotating drum around which a heavy steel cable was wound. That drum could spool in 1,000 feet of cable with enough force to drag a 10-ton log up a 40-degree slope. It was loud in the way industrial machinery is loud. Not just sound, but vibration, a physical presence you felt in your sternum and the soles of your feet. Standing near a running donkey engine, you didn't just hear it, you absorbed it. The man who ran it was called the donkey puncher. He stood at the controls, throttle, brake, drum clutch, reading cable tension by sound and feel, responding to bell signals from the rigging crew below. A good puncher could feel when the cable was about to part. He could ease the throttle a half second before the wire gave way, and sometimes prevent a disaster. A poor one, or an exhausted one, or one being pushed by a foreman to run the drum faster than was safe, could turn 500 feet of steel cable into a weapon in under 2 seconds. The donkey engine didn't replace danger in the logging industry. It concentrated it. Before the donkey, the primary hazard was the tree itself. The falling trunk, the snapping branch, the widowmaker limb that dropped without warning. After the donkey arrived, you had all of those hazards plus the cable. And the cable, as men would learn at terrible cost across the next 3 decades, operated by rules that most workers didn't fully understand until it was too late. Your job, if you were a choker setter, was to get the cable attached to the log. The choker was a short length of wire rope, maybe 20 feet, with a hook and a sliding noose. You took it, scrambled through the debris of the cutting, slashed piles, mud, exposed root systems, upended stumps, found the end of the log, and looped the choker around it. And then you gave the signal. 3 bells meant go. And the donkey puncher, 100 yards uphill, opened the throttle. The main line snapped taut with a sound like a rifle shot every time the drum engaged. You felt it in your teeth. You felt it through the ground under your boots. The cable, which had been lying slack in the mud, suddenly carried thousands of pounds of tension, and the log began to move, faster than you expected the first time, bouncing over stumps, swinging sideways, kicking up debris in every direction. Here is what the cable looked like when inert. A heavy, greasy rope of twisted steel wire, passive and inanimate. Here is what it was when the drum turned. A stored spring under enormous tension, capable of releasing energy faster than any human being could respond. It didn't look dangerous lying still, and that was the lie that killed men. A Washington State Bureau of Labor report from the early 1910s noted that haste in setting chokers was repeatedly identified as a contributing factor in accident investigations. The choker setter was, by most accounts of the era, the most dangerous job in the logging industry. Not the most dramatic. That might go to the timber faller, whose work announced itself with 200 feet of falling timber. The choker setter's danger was quieter, faster, and in many ways more insidious, because it arrived without the warning sounds that experienced fallers learned to read. One man who worked a Coast Range operation recalled simply, You knew what you were doing was dangerous. Everybody knew. But if you slowed down, the rigging boss would have your job filled by noon. That's not bravery. That's economics. You set the choker, you signaled, you ran, you pulled, you trusted, you prayed, and then you went back into the slash and did it again, all day, every day. When a wire rope parts under tension, it doesn't go slack. It releases all of that stored energy instantly, and the two ends travel outward from the breakpoint at velocities that accident investigators described as too fast to observe. Witnesses reported hearing the crack of the parting wire, then finding a man down. Nothing in between. Oregon accident reports from this period documented injuries including skull fractures, amputations, and chest trauma caused by cable snapback. The phrase, "struck by flying cable," appeared with the same bureaucratic flatness used to describe a man falling off a ladder. Some reports suggest improperly spliced connections were at fault, and others point to overdrumming, running the cable too fast, building heat and stress in the wire. The records often contradict each other. What they agree on is the result. No warning, just the crack. Then a man on the ground. The hung log made everything worse. A log being dragged uphill, caught on a stump or root, stopped moving while the cable kept pulling, and tension built in the line until something gave. Someone had to go in and free it. That someone was usually the choker setter, whoever was closest and lowest in the hierarchy, which meant whoever had the least power to refuse. You crawled back toward the log that was under tension. The cable was still live. The drum was still engaged, or the brake was holding a load that was waiting to release. Labor investigators documenting Pacific Northwest logging fatalities in the 1910s found this scenario recurring in accident reports with grim consistency. Men crushed when tension suddenly released, men struck when the log swung free, men caught by cable when the puncher opened the throttle at the wrong moment. Exhaustion played its part. By mid-afternoon, after hours in the slash, after the noise and the cold and the weight of wet clothing, your judgment was not what it had been at 6 in the morning. You knew you were tired. You went in anyway, because the board footage had to move, because stopping meant someone else would do it, and you'd be judged. The camp ran on this calculus, and everyone knew it, and men kept dying year after year. The winter months were when the numbers climbed. The Oregon Bureau of Labor annual reports from the early 1900s documented seasonal patterns in logging fatalities, with the wet season consistently showing elevated death rates compared to summer operations. The reasons were multiple and compounding in the way that industrial disasters always are. Mud made the terrain worse. A hillside manageable in August became treacherous in December. Logs rolling unpredictably on wet ground, debris concealing footing hazards, the donkey's skids shifting on muddy soil and changing the angle of the cable, pull in ways that altered the mechanics of every lift. Cold-numbed hands and slowed reaction times. Wire rope stiffens in low temperatures, becomes less flexible, more prone to kinking. And a kinked section under load was a documented failure point. Some period investigations noted that cable condition was rarely checked during winter operations because stopping to inspect rigging meant stopping production, and that was not something operators were inclined to do. The signals were harder to read in winter, too. A Washington State Industrial Insurance Department investigation from the mid-1910s documented multiple fatalities attributed to signal miscommunication, noting, "The bell system in use at this operation was found to be unreliable in high wind conditions, and it is believed that the victim received or gave a signal that was misinterpreted by the engineer." The victim's name was not recorded in the public summary. His role was listed as rigging crew. What kills you faster, the tree or the weight? Some men said the waiting was the worst part. The moment between setting the choker and scrambling clear when you were still in the path of the log and the cable hadn't gone taut yet. You had done everything right. You were moving, but the geometry of where you thought it was safe to stand could be wrong in ways you wouldn't discover until it was too late. In a Coast Range operation during the winter of 1906, the specific camp unidentified in the surviving account, a rigging crew lost 2 men in a single week, one to a parted choker cable, one to a hung log. The foreman's note in the company record read, "Operations continued, replacements sourced from Astoria." In the company ledger, it was accidental death. To his widow, it was Tuesday. The trap is worth naming clearly. The men in these camps were not free agents making informed choices about acceptable risk. They owed money to the company store before their first paycheck arrived. They had traveled so far into the Coast Range that leaving meant walking out without wages already deducted toward a region where the next employer was likely another camp running the same system. Oregon Labor Commission testimony from the early 1900s described men who tried to leave mid-season and were told their scrip would not be converted to cash until term's end, weeks of work held as collateral against their continued presence. One witness described it plainly. "You owed more than you made. Every week you owed more." That's not employment. That's something closer to debt peonage, and historians of Pacific Northwest labor have used that term explicitly when describing the camp scrip system of this era. Violence was a documented feature of camp life, and not an aberration. Alcohol, officially prohibited in many camps, widely available regardless, served as both escape and accelerant. Fights between men sleeping in close quarters under continuous stress, eating poor food, cut off from family and any social world beyond the camp, were regular enough that company records sometimes noted them with the same flat affect as weather observations. And when a man died, the company's response, documented consistently across Labor Commission records, was replacement. Not investigation, not changed procedures, replacement. Another man off the supply road, another name in pencil in the timekeeper's book. The machine kept running. Reform did come eventually. Oregon and Washington passed stronger workplace inspection laws in the early 1910s. Washington's Industrial Insurance Act of 1911 created a state workers' compensation system that gave injured workers a path to compensation that didn't require suing the employer who controlled their housing, their food, and their access to transportation. Real improvements. They mattered. But the choker setter was still crawling into slash under live cables in 1915. The speed pressure hadn't been legislated away, and the names already lost stayed lost, recorded in totals, not in individual entries. The graves were mostly unmarked. Logging camps were not established communities with churches and cemeteries. A man who died in the woods might be buried close to where he fell in ground that would later be logged over, or transported to the nearest town for burial in a plot paid for, if anything was paid at all, by a small collection among the surviving crew. Go into the Coast Range today and you'll find the stumps. The old-growth firs were cut and gone in a few decades, and what grew back is second growth, thinner, younger, a different forest entirely. But the original stumps are still there in places, massive and weathered, some of them 8 feet across. Put your hand on one, and you are touching something that a man with a crosscut saw stood next to at 4 in the morning when the fog was still on the ground and his boots were already wet. The steam donkey is gone. The diesel yarder replaced it, more powerful, more reliable, with better safety systems and operators who work under regulations that the men of the 1900s could not have imagined. But the physics are the same. A cable under load stores energy. When it fails, it releases that energy without warning. The fundamental danger of moving massive weight with steel rope through rough terrain has not been fully engineered away even now. The signal line you reach for in the dark that first morning, that thin rope strung through the timber connected to a bell, is a museum piece now. But the men who worked it, who learned to hear the difference between 2 bells and 3, who sometimes heard it wrong and paid with everything, those men paid for the knowledge that eventually made the system better. They paid for regulations they never lived to see. They paid for safety standards they had no part in writing. They paid with the thing they couldn't replace. The stumps remain. the names are mostly gone. When you see a wooden beam in an old house or a weathered boardwalk along a waterfront, remember where it came from. Remember the men who brought it out of the forest, who gambled their lives for a day's pay, who knew that every pull of the cable could be their last. The trees are gone, but their legacy remains, built on exhaustion, on debt, on the kind of courage that comes from having no other choice. What do you think? Was the cost worth it? Or could we have done better? Share your thoughts below.